It was almost midnight when I opened my door and found Kate standing in the hallway, still wearing the champagne silk dress from her engagement party. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, and her hand was bare where a ring should have been. She stepped inside without a word. The ring slipped from her fingers, rolled across my floor, and stopped beside the little celadon dish on my counter. I knelt to pick it up. When I looked up, her face was close to mine, her breath unsteady. The ring sat small in my open palm, between us. She whispered, almost without any sound at all, "Stay with me tonight. My name is Ryan. I'm 34 years old, and I drive an ambulance for a living in Portland, Oregon. I live alone in Unit 4B of an old brick building called the Marlowe, on the east side of the river, where the floors creak and the radiators knock and the light comes in gold in the late afternoon. I'd been divorced 2 years by the time this story finds me. No children. Just me, a set of scrubs by the door, and a quiet apartment that stays quiet. I'm telling you all of this from where I stand now, which is a long way past that night. I already know how the story ends. I know every truth I was too slow to see, so if my voice sounds calm, it's because the fear has worn off and only the understanding is left. People trust a paramedic's hands to be steady. That's the whole job, really being the still thing in a room full of panic. Somebody's father is on the kitchen floor. Somebody's kid isn't breathing right, and the family looks at you the way you look at a lighthouse. You keep your hands from shaking so theirs can. Nobody ever asks if the rest of you is steady too. Nobody asks what the man with the calm hands is like when he goes home, closes the door, and finds there's no one there to be brave for. I was good at the door part. Coming home, going still, keeping things folded and put away. After my marriage ended, I got very good at taking up as little space as I could, even in my own life. The marriage was to a woman named Vanessa. She's 2 years younger than me, and she was the loudest room I ever walked into, bright, quick, always certain the story was about her, because in her telling it always was. She left in the fall of 2023. On her way out, she handed everyone a version of things that was easy for her to carry. That I was married to the job, that I was never really there, that a man who works nights can't love anyone in the daylight. It wasn't true, but I'm not a man who defends himself out loud, so I let it stand. I let people believe the convenient thing. It costs less than arguing, or so I told myself. Across the hall from me, in 4A, lived Kate. She teaches art at a high school a few blocks over, and she makes pottery in the evenings, you could always tell, because her hands had a faint dust of dried clay on them, like she'd been holding on to something soft all day. She was everything Vanessa wasn't. Quiet. Honest in a way that didn't need an audience. Warm without ever making a show of it. The day I moved into the Marlowe, still carrying boxes with my whole married life inside them, Kate knocked on my open door. She was holding a small dish she'd made herself. Glazed a pale blue-green celadon. She called it later, when I finally asked. There was a little card tucked under it. I don't even remember thanking her properly. I was too tired and too hollow to notice much of anything. She handed me that dish like it was nothing, and I took it like it was nothing. But I kept it. For 2 years, I dropped my keys into that dish every time I walked in, and I never once stopped to ask myself why a thing so small had become the first thing I touched coming home and the last thing I touched going out. It just fit there. It fit the way certain people fit before you have the sense to notice. Here's the thing I have to tell you before we go any further, and it's the hardest part for me to say. For 2 years, I read something wrong, something that was right in front of me, every single day, in the plainest handwriting a person can offer another person. I read it as kindness. I read it as a good neighbor being good, and I said nothing, and I did nothing, because it never once occurred to me that the message was meant for me. That's the man I was when Kate knocked on my door in that dress. Now let me tell you about the years that led up to it. That night, she stayed silent, and I didn't ask her to explain. I've learned that people in shock don't need questions, They need somebody to sit close enough that the room stops feeling so large. So that's what I did. I put a blanket around her shoulders, and I sat down on the other end of the sofa, and I stayed. "Stay with me tonight," she'd said. And I understood it the way she meant it, not as an invitation to anything, but as a plea against the empty hours. Don't leave me alone in the dark with this. So I didn't. We sat there while the city blurred and pulsed behind the window, and the only thing I offered her was the one thing I've always known how to give. I kept still. I kept my hands steady. I let the quiet do the work that words would only have ruined. She drifted off sometime before dawn, sitting up, her head tipping toward the cushion. I stayed awake. I sat there in the gray light and watched over her the way I'd watch a patient whose numbers I didn't quite trust yet, and I told myself it was because that's what I'm trained to do. That's the lie I could still believe at 4 in the morning. Because here's what I hadn't let myself put together yet, even though the pieces had been sitting on the table for 2 whole years. When I first moved in, I worked a lot of doubles, 16-hour shifts that spat me out at the curb at some ugly hour, wrung dry, and more mornings than I can count, there'd be something outside my door. A jar of soup, still warm, wrapped in a dish towel. A little container of whatever she'd made too much of. Never a note, asking for thanks. Just food, left quietly. The way you leave water out for something you're worried about but don't want to frighten. I thought she was being a good neighbor. That's what I told myself. A kind woman across the hall who couldn't stand the idea of a tired man eating nothing. Then there were the faucets. Kate's faucet dripped a lot. That first year. Her garbage disposal jammed. A cabinet hinge came loose. It's funny, I never once wondered how a woman who could throw a perfect bowl on a pottery wheel, who could fire and glaze and build things with her hands all day, somehow couldn't manage a leaky faucet. I just came over when she asked. I fixed the thing, whatever it was, and then somehow it was an hour later and we were still standing in her doorway talking, and neither of us had turned to go. That was the shape of it, for 2 years. Little repairs that didn't really need me. Evenings that started at a threshold and forgot to end. She knew how I took my coffee. She knew which nights I dreaded and which ones I didn't. She remembered things about me I'd only said once, in passing, half asleep. And I gathered up all of that attention and I filed it under kindness, because kindness was the only word I'd let myself use. You've probably already seen it. You're probably ahead of me right now, the way an audience is always ahead of the man telling the story. You can see what I couldn't. A woman doesn't keep a tired stranger fed for 2 years out of good manners. A woman doesn't invent broken faucets. She was telling me something, in the plainest language she had, every single day, and she was doing it in a way that let her hide the whole truth inside a smaller, safer one. Because that's what she was doing that night, too, when she asked me to stay. On the surface it was simple. I don't want to be alone. I trust you. Both of those things were true, completely true. But they were the true things she could say out loud, and they were covering the truer thing underneath. The one she couldn't. That of all the doors in the world she could have knocked on when her life came apart, she came to mine. Not because I was safe, because it was me. It had been me for a long time. I want to be honest about how close we came, all those months, without ever crossing over. There was a night, maybe a year in, when we were washing up after she'd cooked, and our hands touched under the water at the sink. Just knuckles, just for a second. We both pulled back like we'd been caught at something. Neither of us said a word. We just went very carefully back to the dishes, and the air in that little kitchen was so full I could barely breathe through it. That's the thing I'd never let myself feel long enough to name. There was a question that lived under everything by then, unspoken, and it got louder the longer we didn't ask it. What are we, exactly? What is this? We'd built something real, I knew that much. I just didn't have the courage, or maybe the belief that I deserved it, to say the word for what it was. So I let it stay a question, because a question can't hurt you the way an answer can. Looking back, I can see how much she said without saying it. She'd time her evenings to my schedule without ever admitting she'd learned it. She kept a spare mug in her cupboard that was only ever mine, the heavy gray one, because I'd once mentioned I hated thin-walled cups. When I came home rough from a call that had gone bad, she seemed to already be in the hallway. Her door cracked, the light behind her warm, as if she'd been listening for the particular sound my footsteps made on a hard night. I noticed all of it. I just refused to add it up. Adding it up would have meant believing I was someone worth waiting for, and that was the one arithmetic I couldn't make myself do. And then there was the ring. That morning after her engagement fell apart, when the light finally came up, I was still holding the ring I'd picked up off the floor the night before. Her engagement ring, the one she'd worn to a party that was supposed to begin the rest of her life, and taken off before she came to me. I set it in the celadon dish on my counter, meaning to give it back to her. Later, I said, when you're ready, return it, or send it back to him, or do whatever you need to do. She never took it. Days passed, and then weeks, and that ring stayed right where I'd put it. In the dish, on top of my keys. And every time I came home and dropped my keys in there, they landed next to that ring, and I'd look at the two of them sitting together, the small, sharp evidence of the life she'd walked out of, resting against the plain business of my ordinary days, and something in my chest would go tight, and I wouldn't have a name for that either. I'd made that dish the place where I put the things that mattered without ever deciding to. My keys, so I could always leave and always come back. And now her ring, which meant she hadn't gone anywhere. 2 lives, set down in the same small blue-green bowl she'd handed me on the worst day of my old life, back when I was too broken to understand what I was being handed. One evening she was over, we'd fallen back into it easily, the way you do, and she saw the dish on the counter, and she went still for a second, looking at it. You still use it, she said, not a question. It's a good dish, I told her, like a fool. She looked at me then, and there was something in her face I'd been not seeing for 2 years. That's not why I asked, she said, very softly, and I still didn't understand. God help me. I told myself she stayed close because I was the safe one, the steady one, the neighbor who kept his hands from shaking. It never once occurred to me that being safe wasn't the accident. It was the whole point. That steadiness was the thing she'd been coming home to all along. I have to back up to the morning after that first night, because that's where the trouble walked in. When the sun came up, Kate crossed the hall to her own apartment. She was still in the champagne dress, shoes in her hand, her hair a wreck from a night on my sofa. Nothing had happened. I want to be clear about that, then and now, but I've been around enough people to know that the truth of a thing and the look of a thing are 2 different animals. And that morning, the look of it was a woman leaving a man's apartment at dawn in last night's party dress. Of all the mornings for Vanessa to show up, she chose that one. I hadn't heard from my ex-wife in months, but her latest relationship had come apart. I'd learned that part later, and she'd gotten it into her head that maybe the thing she'd thrown away was worth a second look, now that I was steady and settled and not making a scene about any of it. She'd come to talk about coming back. That was the plan she arrived with. Instead, she stepped out of the elevator just in time to watch Kate slip into 4A in a formal dress with her shoes in her hand, and I watched Vanessa's whole face rearrange itself. Whatever soft speech she'd rehearsed died right there. What replaced it was something I knew well from the old days, that bright, narrowing look she got when she'd decided the story was about her again, and someone else was going to pay for it. Well, she said, you didn't waste much time. I didn't explain. Of course I didn't. I never do. I let her think what was easy, the same way I always had, and I told myself the truth would sort itself out. That was a mistake. Silence isn't neutral. When you refuse to tell your side of a thing, you hand someone else the pen. A few weeks went by. Kate and I were finding our way, slow and careful, both of us still circling the thing we hadn't named. And then Vanessa called with a reason to come by that I couldn't refuse without looking petty. There was a box of her things I'd been storing in my hall closet since the divorce, and she wanted it. Fair enough. You can't hold someone's belongings hostage. So I said yes, and I let her in, and that was the second mistake. She made a slow circle of my apartment, the way she used to, touching things, taking inventory, and she stopped at the counter. She picked up the Celadon dish, my keys and Kate's ring and all, and she turned it over in her hands with a little curl of her mouth, like it was something she'd found at a yard sale. "This is hideous," she said lightly. "Did you actually pay for this?" "Put it down, Vanessa." But she'd already seen it. Underneath the dish, where it had sat for 2 years, was the little card Kate had tucked there the day I moved in. I'd never thrown it out. I'd never even really read it, not with the eyes it was written for. Vanessa slid it out, and she read it, and I watched her understand something faster than I ever had. "Oh," she said slowly. "Oh, this is good. That's not yours. Put it back." She didn't. She held it up between 2 fingers and looked at me like she'd just been dealt the winning card in a game I hadn't known we were playing. 2 years, she said. "She's been in love with you for 2 years, Ryan. It's all right here." She tapped the card. "Since the day you moved in, while you were still bleeding out over me." She laughed, and it wasn't a kind sound. "Do you not see what happened here?" She waited. She waited 2 whole years, feeding you, fixing you, keeping you on a little string across the hall. And then the second her own engagement got shaky, she blew the whole thing up and came straight to your door. "Stay with me tonight." God. That wasn't a woman falling apart. That was a woman collecting. That's not what this is, isn't it? Who waits 2 years unless they're playing a long game? You were never the man she loved, Ryan. You were the exit she was keeping warm. And here is the thing I'm least proud of in this whole story. For a moment, just a moment, it worked. Because Vanessa hadn't told a single outright lie. Kate had loved me for 2 years. Kate had kept it hidden. Kate had gotten engaged, and then walked out of that engagement, and then come to me. Every fact was true. Vanessa had just taken those true things and strung them into a shape that made the kindest person I knew look like a schemer. And for one ugly moment I stood in my own kitchen and let myself wonder if the soup and the faucets and the quiet had all been a plan I'd been too dumb to see. A man who's already been left once will believe almost anything about being wanted, especially the ugliest version. Because the ugliest version doesn't ask him to risk hoping. What I didn't know, what I'd find out only later, was that Kate had come by to return a book, and she was standing in the hallway outside my open door. She heard all of it. She heard her whole secret, the tender private thing she'd protected for 2 years, get picked up by a stranger and turned into a weapon. She didn't come in. She didn't defend herself. Not really. When I finally noticed her there in the doorway, she showed nothing on her face at all. Her hand was closed hard around the edge of her cardigan, the knuckles gone pale, and she was very carefully not looking at either of us. "Believe whatever's easier," she said, and her voice was flat and level and worse than any shout. It usually wins. Then she went back across the hall, and the door of 4A closed. Not a slam. Just a soft, final click, and it stayed closed longer than it ever had before. Vanessa set the dish back down on the counter with a small, satisfied clack of clay against stone my keys, the ring, the card. All of it dropped like it was nothing and picked up her box and left me standing there in the wreckage of a thing she'd broken in under 10 minutes. The soup stopped after that. No more jars at my door in the morning. Her door, which had always seemed to be cracked open on my hard nights, stayed shut and dark. When we passed in the hall, and you can't avoid someone forever when you live 10 feet apart, she'd nod, polite as a stranger, and keep walking. That politeness was the worst part. There's a kind of quiet that means comfort, the kind we'd built over 2 years, and there's a kind that means a door has closed for good, and I'd traded one for the other by standing in my kitchen and letting a woman I'd already left convince me to doubt the one who'd stayed. The hallway between 4A and 4B which had somehow become the warmest 10 feet in my life, went cold and quiet, and I understood, far too late, exactly how much I'd been given by the sheer size of the silence when it stopped. It took me one night to come back to my senses, and it started with dates. I'm a paramedic. I live and die by timelines. When the call came in, when the symptoms started, what happened before what. So, somewhere in the small hours I stopped feeling and started counting, and the moment I laid the events out in order, Vanessa's whole story fell apart in my hands. Kate didn't enter my life while I was married. Kate met me after Vanessa was already gone, after the papers were signed, after I'd carried my broken life into 4B alone. She could not have been the reason my marriage ended, because there was no marriage left by the time she knocked on my door with a dish in her hands. The thing that ended my marriage was Vanessa, her choices, her exit, the story she told to make herself comfortable. That was the truth. And it had been the truth all along, and I'd let it get buried under her noise because I was too tired to dig it up. But the timeline gave me something worse than relief, too. It gave me back the one memory I'd been careful not to look at. About a year and a half in, there was a night we were talking in her doorway, and she'd said something, I don't even remember what, exactly, about the future, about the kind of life she wanted someday. And I, trying to be kind, trying to be humble, said the stupidest, generous thing a man ever said. I told her, "You deserve better than a burnt-out neighbor, Kate." I meant it as a compliment to her. I meant, "You're wonderful. Don't waste yourself on someone like me." But that's not what she heard. She heard a door closing. She heard the one man she wanted tell her, plainly, that he would never let himself be wanted back. And a few months after that, she met Kyle. And she said yes to Kyle, not because she'd stopped loving me, because I'd convinced her that loving me was a dead end, and a person can only stand in a dead end for so long before they try to build a life somewhere it isn't. I had done that. My own humility, my own certainty that I wasn't worth much, had reached across the hall and pushed her toward a wedding she didn't want. That was the reframe that finally broke me open, not the villain, me. I crossed the hall a few mornings later, once I'd finally stopped being a coward about it. I knocked on 4A, and when she opened it, she didn't look angry. She looked tired and honest, the way she always was. "I owe you the truth," I said, "and I owe you an apology for taking 2 years to see it." She didn't make it easy, and she didn't make it hard. She just let me in, and finally, standing in the middle of her clay-dusted apartment, she told me the whole of it. "I did love you," she said, "from almost the beginning. And I hid it not to trap you, whatever she wants to call it. I hid it because you came home wrecked every night, and the last thing you needed was one more person wanting something from you. So I decided I'd just be there, quietly, however you'd let me. And I told myself that was enough." She looked down at her own hands. "The engagement wasn't a plan to get you. It was me trying to give up on you, because you told me to, and I couldn't go through with it. I stood up at my own party and I could not say the words, because they were for the wrong person." She took a breath. "I wasn't waiting to win you, Ryan. I was just waiting to stop disappearing. That night, I knocked. I wasn't laying a trap. I was done pretending I wasn't home. I went and got the dish. I brought it back to her doorway, and I slid the little card out from under the keys and the ring, and for the first time in 2 years I read it the way it was written. It was short. It just said she was glad it was me who'd moved in across the hall, that the whole floor felt brighter with me on it, and she'd signed it, and drawn a tiny coffee cup beside her name, like a small, easy invitation to come knock sometime. It wasn't a good neighbor's card. It never had been. Read one way, it was nothing a friendly line from the woman across the hall. Read the way it was actually written, it was a quiet woman telling a broken stranger the truth, and trusting him to be too broken to notice until he was ready. She had used the smaller reason to carry the larger one, the same way she'd done every single day since. The dish wasn't a scheme. It was 2 years of the plainest love I've ever been handed, sitting on my counter, holding my keys, waiting for me to catch up. I chose her. There wasn't really a choosing to it, it was more like finally admitting where I already lived. And Vanessa, who'd tried to turn Kate's love into a weapon, had only managed to lay it out in full view, so bright and so patient that even I couldn't miss it anymore. She'd handed me the proof while trying to sell me the doubt. I called her once, told her there was nothing to come back to and never would be, and that was the last of it. There was one step of empty hallway between 4A and 4B. For 2 years, I'd stood on my side of it and called that distance safety. That morning, for the first time, I was the one who crossed it. What came after wasn't dramatic, and I'm glad. We'd both had enough drama to last a lifetime. What came after was ordinary, in the best sense of the word. It started slow, the way I think real things are supposed to. She didn't move in, and I didn't ask her to. But the doors between 4A and 4B started standing open more than they stood closed. I'd come home from a shift and find her at my kitchen table. A stack of her students' drawings spread out under the lamp, a pen behind her ear, and she'd look up and say something about a kid who'd finally figured out perspective, and I'd feel that old tight thing in my chest turn into something warm and easy instead. Her keys started ending up in the dish. That was how I marked it. Privately, not a conversation, not a decision. Just one evening when I dropped my keys in the little Celadon bowl, and hers were already there. Tangled up with mine, clay dust still on the ring of them. 2 sets of keys in a dish she'd made with her own hands. I stood there and looked at it for a long time. The soup came back, too. Except now it came back with her sitting across from me while I ate it, telling me about her day, instead of left in secret at a door. That's the difference love makes when it finally gets to stop hiding. The same kindness, just no longer disguised as anything smaller than it was. I got to watch her make things. On the weekends, she'd set up at the wheel by the window, and I'd sit nearby and watch a lump of wet clay rise up into a bowl under her hands. It was the most patient thing I'd ever seen a person do, the way she'd let it wobble and then gently bring it back to center, over and over, never forcing it, until the shape she wanted simply arrived. I remember thinking that was exactly what she'd done with me, never forcing anything, just keeping her hands steady and waiting for me to come back to center for 2 whole years, and never once telling me that's what she was doing. Fall turned into winter. Winter let go into spring. Nearly a whole year went by from the night she stood in my hallway in that champagne dress, and somewhere in there we stopped keeping track of whose apartment was whose coffee, whose blanket, whose slow Saturday morning. The hallway between our 2 doors, the 10 feet I'd once guarded like a border, just became the hallway. A place you walk through on your way to the person you were always going to end up beside. And on an evening in spring, with the light coming across the floorboards gold the way it does in that old building, I did the one deliberate thing. I bought a ring. Not a grand one, Kate would have hated a grand one. A simple band, the kind of thing that looks like it was always meant to be worn while working, while making something with your hands. And I didn't get down on one knee in a restaurant. I didn't fill a room with candles. I thought about the first ring in this whole story. The one that started everything, the ring that had come loose and rolled across my floor and ended up beside that dish, thrown away by a life she was walking out of. I'd knelt to pick that one up off the ground. It had never been mine to give. So I did the opposite. I took the new ring, and one ordinary evening, I set it in the Celadon dish by the door, on top of the keys, right where her old ring had once sat like a question nobody would answer. I didn't drop it. I didn't leave it behind by accident. I chose it, and I placed it, and then I sat down on the sofa, and I waited for her to come home. She came in a little while later, arms full of something from the car, and she went to put her keys in the dish the way she always did now. And she stopped. I watched her see it. I watched her go completely still, that stillness I'd learned to read as the loudest thing she had. She didn't gasp. She didn't turn around all at once. She just stood there with her hand hovering over the dish, And then, slowly, she set her palm flat against the cool blue-green glaze. "The way you touch something to make sure it's real. You put it in the dish," she said, finally. Her voice was very quiet. "Seemed like the right place," I said. "Everything that ever mattered ended up in there anyway." She was quiet for another moment. "And then, because we're both people who've been hurt, and being hurt makes you careful," she asked the small, honest thing instead of the easy one. "Are you sure? Really sure?" I didn't answer with words. I got up and crossed the room, the same handful of steps I'd finally learned how to take, and I stood in front of her the way I had that first night when I'd knelt on the floor with someone else's ring in my hand and no idea what mine was worth, except this time I wasn't guessing. She took the ring out of the dish. She looked at it for a second, turning it in the lamplight so the plain metal caught the gold, and then she slid it onto her own finger. She didn't wait for me to do it. She never needed anyone to do things for her, and the corner of her mouth lifted into the smallest, steadiest smile I have ever been given. Then she did the thing that undid me completely. She reached over, took her keys, and set them down in the dish next to mine. Both sets, together, on top of nothing now, no old ring, no old life, no question left to answer. Just 2 sets of keys in a bowl she'd made, in the home we'd stopped pretending wasn't already ours. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay. The whole rest of my life in 2 letters. We didn't call anyone right away. We didn't take a picture. We just stood in that gold light with 2 sets of keys and 1 plain ring in a dish she'd made with her own hands. And for once in my life I didn't feel the need to be steady for anybody, because the person in front of me had never needed me to be anything other than there. An ordinary evening had quietly become the one I'd tell people about for the rest of my life, and neither of us said much at all, because after 2 years of me not hearing what she was saying, we'd finally found the one thing that didn't need to be said out loud. I still keep the dish by the door. It's the first thing I touch when I come home, and the last thing I touch when I leave, and now there are 2 sets of keys in it, and a marriage that started with a ring I once knelt to pick up off the floor. That night she stood in my hallway and asked me to stay. I thought I was the strong one. I thought she was the one who needed holding, and I was the steady set of hands that would get her through the dark. It took me 2 years to understand that I'd had it exactly backwards. She wasn't the one who needed saving. She was the one who'd been quietly holding the door open for me the whole time, feeding me, waiting for me, loving me in a language plain enough that a child could have read it while I, the man with the steady hands, stood there and called it kindness because I was too afraid to call it what it was. Some people knock on a door because they're lost. Kate knocked because she'd finally found the courage to stop pretending she wasn't home. So let me ask you something before you go. Have you ever misread someone's kindness for 2 whole years, or been the one whose kindness got misread? And if she'd never found the nerve to knock that night, do you think either of us would have ever said it out loud, or would we have just stood on our own sides of that hallway forever, calling the distance safety? If this story stayed with you, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and tell me down in the comments, was staying the brave thing to do, or the honest one? I'd really like to know.